What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Sheehan Show with me, Sean Sheehan, here on Sherdog.com. And it's a little bit of a different show today, as I want to talk about Max Holloway, because obviously he's fighting this weekend, UFC 308 versus Ilia Topuria, but also Topuria himself. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the matchup, but I want to talk about the history of the featherweight division as well. Who is the greatest of all time? Maybe I won't even get to an answer, or give you an answer, or give my thoughts on that necessarily, but maybe we'll have a look at the facts, the figures, who fought who beat who and all, because I think it's the most interesting division, and there's no doubt about that in terms of who the greatest of all time is. Because if you look through the other divisions, right, flyweight, no doubt about it, we all know it's Demetrius Johnson. Bantamweight, I suppose, is the closest. Maybe we can have a bit of a debate there, obviously, because Dominic Cruz was out injured for so long. We know the story with TJ Dillashaw and obviously failed drug tests and things like that as well. But at lightweight is the exact opposite to featherweight. That in featherweight there's like 5 or 6 strong candidates. In lightweight there's almost no strong candidates. Some people will say, oh, it's definitely Habib. Some people will say, oh, it's definitely BJ Penn. Some people will say, if Makhachev wins 1 or 2 more, it's definitely him. There's a lot of debate there, but I don't think anyone is like, there's no strong debate there. At welterweight, it's obviously GSP, with Usman obviously was coming in behind him, but didn't reach that. Middleweight, again, obviously Anderson, exact same thing happened to Adesanya. He was coming along, but obviously kind of fell at the 2 or 3 hurdles away from maybe getting close to Anderson. Same at light heavyweight, obviously it's John Jones. No one's gotten close to him. There was a bit of debate going on last week who's going to be number 2 and 3, and in my opinion Chuck Liddell is kind of the clear number 2, and Daniel Cormier is around there as well, Gustafsson, Ortiz, Randy Couture and others like that. You'll put him in there as well. At heavyweight, again, we can have a bit of debate there, but most people I think would say Stipe about now, and then obviously Fedor and Cain Velasquez and Junior Dos Santos and Verdum and others there as well. And then obviously in the women's divisions, in the UFC are obviously a little bit newer, but we have, obviously Amanda Nunes is the GOAT at 35/ maybe even 45, and Rousey is in there obviously as well, and we've Shevchenko at 125, and maybe there's a bit more of a debate at kind of 115. But I think at featherweight, at men's featherweight, we have I would say not necessarily a dead heat between a lot of people, but lads with very, very similar how would you put it, CVs, and then a lot of lads who have fought each other. So the champions and I was going to start with Holloway, but maybe we'll start with the featherweight division, and then maybe we'll get to Holloway at the end. I was going to do it the opposite way, but here we go. So in the history of the UFC, the champions in the featherweight division have been Jose Aldo, Conor McGregor won the interim against Chad Mendes, then he won obviously against Jose Aldo. Then McGregor went up, relinquished the belt or was stripped or whatever. Aldo again obviously was the champion, and then for the interim champion first, then the regular champion, the undisputed champion, then we had Holloway, again the same interim and undisputed. Then Volkanovski, then Yair Rodriguez, and Ilia Topuria we have now, right? First of all, we're going to just write off Yair Rodriguez. That was kind of a very meaningless interim belt, and he lost it pretty quickly. So he's the only one that's not in the conversation so far. Topuria just won it, right? So he's, he obviously isn't in the conversation for the greatest yet, but the fact, very similar to McGregor, he beat the dominant guy, and now he's going to fight another guy who was the dominant guy before him. So I think they're in a kind of similar position now, if you want to put it that way. So I think there are many good arguments to be made for lots of the guys here. Like, if you look, like, it's hard to look past what Jose Aldo has done, right? Because he was the first. He set the stage. He held it for so long. Look at his record. He beat Hominick, Florian, Mendes, Edgar, Chan Sung Jung, Lamas, and Mendes again. And obviously then he beat Frankie Edgar in 2016. Then in 16 he became the undisputed champion. Very, very hard to look past that. It's like 7 title defenses, won the belt back a couple of times. Was dominant for so long. Obviously, the fight was in 2015 against McGregor in December. It was 4 years where he held 4.5 years where he held the title and defended a lot. There was a lot of injuries and stuff along the way as well for Aldo, but I was going to say not much controversy. There was a bit of controversy. Remember with that P test that was thrown over the shoulder and the Brazilian thing and all. So there is that bit of controversy, I suppose, you can throw in there throughout his run. But I think you look at Jose Aldo and there was a thing that happened before. I mean, you have to speak about Jose Aldo in the terms I just spoke about him, but you have to also speak about him in the terms which I think it was John Kavanagh who brought it up, and I think it was funny enough a while back. Myself and Tommy Toll are talking about it, and I put up, and maybe it's Tommy actually put up a poll, or we were talking about it anyway, and the poll was, who is the greatest featherweight of all time? This was a few years ago. Was it Aldo, McGregor, or Holloway? And John Kavanagh replied, if only they had fought each other to find out, right? Which is an argument that falls down a little bit at times, but also it's a pretty compelling argument, isn't it? Like, and here we go. Do you know what I'm going to do here, right? I'm going to argue everyone's case, right? So I've argued Jose Aldo's. I'll argue further in a second. Let's argue McGregor's case. He beat Aldo. He knocked him out in, 11 seconds or whatever it was. He beat Max Holloway as well. Okay, it's not the same Max Holloway. McGregor was actually talking about that this week. It's not the same Max Holloway. He's improved an awful lot. But he still went in there. He beat Max Holloway. He beat Chad Mendes, who was probably the best fighter. Would you agree with that? Maybe Frank Yeager, but Chad and Frankie, I think, were probably even enough. I know they fought. Chad won that fight, didn't he? Do you know what? Let's. I have Sherdog.com up in front of me here. Let's see. No, he actually lost to Frank. He did, yeah, that punch. That was actually, my brother was at that fight, I think, was he? I don't know. Maybe not. Anyway, no, it was Faber and Faber and Edgar that he was at. But anyway, that was kind of, that was the third to last fight of Mendez's MMA career. So, but at the same time, it was just after McGregor, and he had just been knocked out with McGregor as well. I suppose you could put it that way as well. But at the same time, McGregor did beat 3 of the best featherweights of all time. He has the greatest knockout in featherweight history, the greatest title win in featherweight history. He beat, at the time, obviously, the greatest featherweight in history, and he made it look easy. Now, the biggest thing against McGregor, and also, at featherweight, he beat Dustin Poirier. He beat Dennis Siver, who was a good heavy featherweight at the time. I remember at the time, I put out a tweet and go, is Dennis Siver the best featherweight McGregor's ever fought? And I think it was Ben Fowlkes that said yes. And that was after he fought Poirier and after he fought Holloway. So, that just tells you at the time, it's easy to be a revisionist history and everything like that. But Dennis Siver was a good, at the time, maybe should that fight have happened? Was it kind of a keep busy fight for McGregor? Yes, absolutely. There's no denying that. But still, Siver was a good fighter in the middle of it. Like, if you look through Aldo's record and some of the guys he beat, was, it's obviously some of them were a lot better than some of them, a Hominick or even a Lamas to a certain extent. No, they were both probably a little bit better, but still, right? So I'm arguing McGregor's case here for a second. So I think after McGregor knocks out Aldo, and he had beaten Holloway and he had beaten Poirier, I think there's all at featherweight, obviously, there's a pretty strong case for him at that point, right? At that point, I think there's a very, very strong case for him. Is there a stronger case? And right now, it's tough. But at the same time, just to go back to Jose Aldo for a second, there's the funny thing about Aldo, right, is if he had been knocked out by McGregor, and in his next fight he lost to Frank Edgar, and then he lost 2 more fights and he retired, I actually think his stretch would be looked at as a featherweight only, would actually probably be looked on more favourably, because they think Jose Aldo's obviously the greatest of all time. He was just finished. McGregor knocked him out, and then he was on the back end of his career. Even though he's not that old, he's young enough. He was on the back end of his career, and he was shot, and it's all over. He's the greatest featherweight of all time until the moment it ended. Where we know that's not the case. He's still one of the best bantamweights in the world right now. He would not need destroyed Frank Edgar, and so the McGregor. There's no one right now arguing that Conor McGregor didn't knock out Jose Aldo in a time that was close to his prime. If not necessarily his prime, he certainly wasn't at the tail end of his career, and no one could argue that, right? So that makes it look better for McGregor and worse for Aldo in that specific logic for this specific argument, right? So to move on to Max Holloway, what Max did over the next while looked to me like a very, very hard argument to actually beat, right? And this is funny because Aldo looked like a hard argument to beat when he was champion. Then McGregor beat him, and well, he knocked him out in 11 seconds. Well, he did beat Mendez. Well, he did beat Poirier. That's a hard argument to beat. And then Holloway becomes a hard argument to beat because what does he do? He beats Jose Aldo twice, like destroys him the second time. He obviously beats Ortega and then beats Edgar again. You know, Edgar who stuck around there and obviously he was a very, very good guy. And you're kind of thinking at that point, who's going to beat Max Holloway here? Like, what's going to actually take him down? Like, he has beaten, you know, the best guy for a long time, and Aldo came back to be the best guy again after, you know, and Max also beat Pettis, obviously, for the interim title, who was, you know, obviously the lightweight champion around that time and a very, very good lightweight as well. So he had beaten some very, very, very good guys. And you're kind of thinking at that stage, like, Max Holloway has gone to a level where he's, you know, and just to look at Max's record again, like some of the guys even after that who he's beaten, but around that time, like the shellacking that he gave to Cater. Now we'll talk about the Volkanovski fights in a second, but you know, beating down Rodriguez, beating down Frankie and Ortega and Aldo a couple of times. Also gone on to do what he did to Arnold Allen, I suppose, in a closer fight, obviously, and Chan Sung Jung as well. And we'll forget about the Gaethje thing for a second, but when we're back talking about Max again, we'll obviously concentrate more on Max towards the end of this, because this is about Max, with obviously UFC 308 coming up today. The featherweight case, as we stand right now, is pretty strong. But as I said, I'll come back to that in a second. And then Volkanovski, you know, we talked about Aldo taking a very, very strong step, McGregor taking a strong step, Holloway taking a strong step. For Volkanovski to go in there, and obviously he'd beaten Jose Aldo before he became the champion, and beat him. I think it was the first time Jose Aldo, and this could be, let me look this up here now before I go out here and say it. But yeah, I believe it's true. I think it's the first time Jose Aldo had ever lost a non-title fight in the UFC, and obviously it was, but it's, you know, the levels of guys who he'd fought in title fights and beaten, and obviously got back to the title fights again. For Volkanovski to be the first one, that meant an awful lot at the time, and obviously it still does. But before that as well, like, he got through Darren Elkins, he got through Chad Mendes, beat Holloway twice, Ortega, Chan Sung Jung, Holloway again, and, you know, beat Rodriguez. Then obviously the two Makasha fights, but then obviously lost to Topuria. But that run is exceptional. It's no doubt about it, I think, overtaking what Holloway's done up until this point, but we'll get back to Holloway in a second. Obviously, you know, what Volkanovski has over the other guys is, one, he has beaten them all except McGregor, right? And he couldn't beat McGregor, you know, because he obviously didn't get the opportunity. Beaten Aldo, beaten Holloway three times now, and twice in a row, and then another time, obviously. And then the last time was so kind of, you know, there was no close decision, no fluke, nothing about it. It was clean and clear at the end. That does an awful lot for him. And then he has so many title defenses as well, obviously defending it 5 times. Holloway first, then Holloway in the defense, then Ortega, Chan Sung Jung, Holloway again, and then beating the interim champion in Rodriguez after that to unify the belts. That is an insane run. That's a run that's up there, you know, with Aldo's. Aldo has 7, obviously. Is Volkanovski's as good as that, or a little bit better? I would think in his, the Chan Sung Jung fight was a bit of a layup for where Chan Sung Jung was at his career at the time. But the others were, you know, to have to go back and beat Holloway over and over and over again, very, very tough to do that. So, like, is there an argument that Volkanovski is a better featherweight than Holloway, McGregor, and Aldo? Yes, I think there is, right? Again, I'm on Volkanovski's side here now for a second. Is there an argument there? Yes, because I think also what Volkanovski did, right, that McGregor didn't necessarily have an opportunity. McGregor did it in his own way, right, in terms of, and they all kind of did it in their own way, utter dominance. So McGregor's utter dominance was before he got the title, obviously, but then in the title fight as well. Volkanovski's utter dominance was like, he had to earn it against Holloway, and then he showed it in the later Holloway fights and in the other fights he had around that, Ortega, Rodriguez, etc. You know, Aldo had utter dominance over all those lads I just mentioned who he fought. And Max Holloway, it felt like, you know, people are even saying, even though I don't believe it, that Max Holloway was teaching people how to defend in the cage during his run. Now, you know, again, we can add in title runs here and non-title fights at featherweight when we're talking about the best featherweight of all time. And I think sometimes people forget that. I was talking last week about the light heavyweights, as I said, and people talk about Pereira and Cormier, and I think they're both kind of level in terms of where they are. But you have to remember that Pereira was a career middleweight up until this point. Cormier was a career heavyweight before that, before he went to light heavyweight, and then after it as well. So, like, there's only, how many fights, like 6, 7, 8 fights or whatever Cormier had, even less for Pereira. Whereas all of these lads, you know, they've all gone to different weight classes, funnily enough, but all of them were, well, McGregor to a lesser extent, but the other lads, career featherweights, you know? And they have an awful lot there and an awful lot to back up an argument if you want to make it for them, right? So it's, I think when Volkanovski got to the end of his run or towards it, when he had taken Holloway out the way he did, the first performance against Makhachev, even though he lost, to come back down and then beat Rodriguez again, I think at that point, I think and maybe it's unfair, but I think a lot of people, their logic was that Alexander Volkanovski was the greatest featherweight of all time, right? I think that was the logic of a lot of people. I think a lot of people believe that. I think a lot of people think he did enough, obviously, to overtake Holloway. As I said, we'll get to Holloway again here in a second, because he'd beaten him so many times, and then he'd more title defenses than him as well. And I think a lot of people looked at him against Jose Aldo, saying, you know, he'd beaten Jose Aldo. He'd beaten the guy who beat down Jose Aldo. And also, I was just talking about how lads dominated. The way Volkanovski dominated was similar to the way Aldo dominated. But Volkanovski's fights, right, 2019 to 23, his title fights. Aldo's 2011 to 2014. So we're talking about a decade later in terms of the sport. You know, the uptake in the sport, how good the sport is now, and no disrespect to any of the older lads in the sport or anything like that, but I think they'd even agree. The level of the sport right now, the level of, like, to have to beat Max Holloway, you know, now versus Max Holloway a decade ago, or, you know, the number 1, number 2, number 3 ranked fighters a decade ago versus the ones now, it's so much tougher to look exceptional against them. And Volkanovski did that. Like, Volkanovski, I've said it many times. I remember I had Luke Thomas on the show here, and we were discussing it, and I've discussed it in the podcast myself many times. Volkanovski was so good, I think people couldn't understand, me included, couldn't understand what he was doing. Like, the level of movement, the level of footwork, the level of adjustments of stances, and he fought a lot longer and taller than he actually is. What he was able to do was just mesmeric, I think. And I think that is all part of it as well. You know, that's all part of what makes greatness. To me, Demetrius Johnson is the greatest fighter of all time. And watching him, you know, it was like watching... It's weird, because there's someone I want to mention here, but I feel it might go over a lot of people's heads. So let's give you a different example. Messi, right? There's two things when you look at a guy like Messi, like a guy like Demetrius Johnson. They look like they're doing it with no effort while doing it in such a metronomic way, right? It looks like it's just A to B to A to B, but in the most naturally, in the most natural way, but in a way that no one else can do, right? That to me is what greatness is. It's like mixing power and magic. You know, that's why I look at people like Messi, like Demetrius Johnson, and others, and I I very rarely say that about anyone. I've been watching a bit of baseball lately, and I've only seen a few games, but watching this guy Shohei Ohtani, you can see it in him. I know nothing about very little about baseball. I just found out how the game works, but you can see it in him. The guy I was going to mention, for the people out there, Joe Canning is his name. He's a famous Irish hurler. you know, this guy majestic, moves like a gazelle, you know, but has the wrists of a table tennis player or something like that. And to me, Volkanovski got about as close to that as Demetrius Johnson, as anyone has gotten to meet Demetrius Johnson. And you know what? I don't think Volkanovski is actually like the gifted athlete that an Aldo is, or that even Holloway is a different sort of athlete, but that definitely that McGregor is as well. So it's even at times more impressive that that he did it that way. So that's the reason I think a lot of people thought he was the best at that time. So let's get to UFC 308 and Holloway and Topuria. And as I said at the start, I want to talk mostly about Holloway, but to touch on Topuria as well. Because, look, if you're having this discussion about Topuria, you're probably having it in 2027 rather than 2024. So maybe it's a discussion for another day, but we can mention it. You look at Max Holloway, right? And you take everything I've said so far. Obviously fought Aldo a couple of times, Pettis, Ortega, Edgar, and the 3 title defenses, but also the title victory and the Pettis one. There's 5. Is it 5 title fights in there? I think it is, versus Volkanovski, obviously 6 as well. Not that much of a difference. Aldo 7, because Aldo obviously brought the fight in there with him. So it's an awful lot. And obviously McGregor had the 2, so not as obviously as many. Topuria as will be coming to his second this weekend. For Holloway to get back to where there's another argument for him, right? Very hard to argue that a guy who has lost 3 times to someone else is better than them, right? It's easy to argue, I think, that that Aldo deserves to be ranked ahead of McGregor in the featherweight rankings, even though he got knocked out in 11 seconds, right? For all the reasons we just gave, right? Could you argue McGregor is ahead of him? You could, right? But even if that's your hard stance, that McGregor is better than Aldo in the GOAT debate at featherweight, I think anyone who isn't completely brainless would also agree that you could argue Aldo, because McGregor didn't defend the belts. He went up to lightweight. He had more of a career at lightweight, whereas Aldo was a career featherweight, especially at the top level. Right. Okay. And then McGregor went to boxing and everything like that. So you could argue that. Very hard. So I went off kilter there a second. Aldo lost to McGregor, but you could still argue that Aldo's better than McGregor. Holloway lost to McGregor, but you could still argue that Holloway is greater than McGregor. And I think, a lot of people would in both cases. In the featherweight division. Right. Can you make that argument for Holloway, who's lost 3 times to Volkanovski? Okay, well, I'll have to go back and watch him again, but one of the fights at least was very, very close. And I myself, I think, definitely scored at least one of the fights for Max Holloway. But the third one, not so much. And I think the second one as well, from what I can remember. But either way, he lost to him 3 times. And in the end, there was no one unconvinced about who the better fighter was. So how... if you're Max Holloway, do you get back to being a greater featherweight than Volkanovski? Well, I think there's 2 ways of doing it, right? I think you beat Ilia Topuria is the first thing you do. So this Saturday night, or Saturday during the day for me now, especially, but everyone in the States as well, he fights Ilia Topuria in a fight which Max Holloway is supposed to lose. It's very rare that Max Holloway goes into a fight, and even when he goes up to lightweight, even if he's like a slight underdog fighting whoever he might be fighting, it's very rare that Max Holloway is supposed to lose, right? There's a difference between someone being supposed to lose and someone being a slight underdog. Like Max Holloway, I'm looking at the betting here. There's one place who's Max Holloway at plus 215. Plus 215. Minus 275 for Topuria. Topuria is nearly a 3-1 favorite over Max Holloway. I'm looking at the betting for Chimaev. Chimaev is less of a favorite than Topuria is, right? That is huge. That is absolutely massive for Max Holloway. So if he beats Topuria, and you go back and you look at his record, and he's beaten, he's beaten who he's beaten. He's beaten Aldo, he's beaten Ortega, he's beaten Edgar, and Topuria as well, who was supposed to be the next guy who beat Volkanovski, yes, and beat him down, knocked him out. You have to put Max Holloway back in the mix, right? Does he overtake Volkanovski if you're looking? And this is weird because you're coming into fighter A beats fighter B beats fighter C, fighter A beats fighter C type of thing. It's messy. But I said there was 2 steps, right? And the thing for Max Holloway, and as I was thinking about this podcast and this rant or whatever you might want to, not a rant, but a discussion, and maybe this could be a 2 to 3 part discussion depending on how results go over the next while. Sitting there yesterday, or a couple of days ago now, what they said, and what pops up on my Twitter, it's Alexander Volkanovski announcing UFC 312 or what number are we on? Whatever, yeah, 312 I think, isn't it? Is that correct? I think it is. In Sydney, and I saw a quote from him, and he was saying, I might fight for the interim title against Lopez, but I'd love to fight the winner of Topuria and Holloway. And my mind went to this and this moment right now, and that, what if Holloway beats Topuria, and what if Holloway goes to Sydney into the backyard of Volkanovski and then beats him as well? If you're a Max Holloway fan and you just heard that sentence there, you must be getting giddy, because we have seen this once before, right? We saw Jose Aldo do it. We saw Jose Aldo lose a fight. And you could argue this is the same thing from Volkanovski's point of view or Holloway's point of view, but we'll get to that in a second. Jose Aldo lost the fight, and then he wasn't meant to beat Frank Edgar. He wasn't meant to go on a run. And when he lost to Max Holloway, he wasn't meant to win fights again. He wasn't meant to climb the ranks and fight for the belt at 135. He wasn't meant to do that. When Max Holloway lost to Volkanovski, he like, I know Max Holloway is still only young. He's only 32 years of age, but by God, he's been fighting a lot longer than a 32-year-old should. 2010, he made his debut all of 14 years ago. MMA fighters are not supposed to last that long. If you're lasting that long, if you're beating Topuria and then you go and beat Volkanovski, you are right back in the mix. You are right there again. And like, obviously, we're talking about featherweight today. You can add in the Gaethje win. Obviously the knockout of the year this year. It's going to be, I think, we all stopped taking notes for knockout of the year back in April when that happened. And you can add that into the greatest of all time discussion, or the greatest, overall greatness discussion, but obviously not the featherweight discussion. But that might be a catalyst as well for him to get back into form and to get back into a way where he can beat Topuria, and back into a way where if he beats Topuria, you're going into that Volkanovski fight, and is Volkanovski the same? Will he be a favorite to beat Volkanovski, and will he beat Volkanovski? And I know we're getting a couple of steps ahead of us here, but I think the featherweight GOAT discussion will, in the next 2 fights, either be sorted or Topuria will be on his way, right? And here's what I mean by that. And here's getting to Topuria. So, if Max Holloway beats Topuria, I think Holloway versus Volkanovski then becomes like almost a fight for the featherweight GOAT strap. I spoke about Messi the other day. Someone, I think it was Marca in Spain, gave him like a GOAT plaque, and he's the greatest of all time. They should have a GOAT plaque for Holloway and Volkanovski, no matter who wins it. I think for Volkanovski, if he beats Holloway again, maybe he'll have to go back and fight Topuria again, but if Max was to beat Topuria and Volkanovski, no doubt about it, right? So that's one side of it. It'll be sorted between the two of them. And I think the other way will be is that Topuria will be on his way, as I said. If you're Ilya Topuria and you look at the record now, 27 years of age, 15-0 right now, just beat, he's a very good run with Herbert, Mitchell, Emmett, Volkanovski. That's a good, top 20 guy, top 15 guy, top 10 guy, top guy. And then he beats Holloway, and then he beats Volkanovski again, possibly. Well, he's in a very similar run to the other guys, right? Right then. Because you're adding in a really good title. You're adding in some really good fights before you get to the title. You're adding in a really good title win against one of the GOATs. You're adding in a title defense against one of the GOATs, and then a second. So he'll be well on his way to becoming the greatest featherweight of all time. So I told you at the start of this video that we'd have a discussion about it, and we mightn't get a result or a conclusion even But I think we have got a conclusion that the next 2 to 3 fights in the featherweight division will either have a definitive answer for us or have Ilia Topuria on the verge. And if Topuria can beat those 2 guys in a row over the next 6 months or so, and then whoever is the next guy coming up, whoever's, whether it's Arnold Allen or, Lopez or whoever it might be, the next guy who puts himself out there, if he wins that fight and then the next fight and a couple of more, maybe, I think we could be talking about Ilia Topuria as the great. But none of that happens. None of that is set. None of that goes down without UFC 308, and it's a fascinating fight. The lads will have a full breakdown. It is. I would stake it that it's already out on the Sherdog YouTube channel here. So check that full card breakdown out. I will have my best bets of the week as well for you in the next couple of days here. So keep it locked on Sherdog.com. Until then, thank you very much for tuning in. My name is Sheehan for Sherdog.com. I'll see you all next time.